Today, you're about to witness a story that will leave you speechless. A story of justice, mercy, and a decision that defied the law itself. Judge Margaret Harrison, known as one of the toughest judges in America, faced a choice she never imagined she would have to make. A convicted criminal hours away from his execution asked for something that no one thought possible: a chance to speak to his daughter one last time. What happens next will shock you, challenge everything you thought you knew about justice, and leave you questioning the true meaning of compassion. Stay with us until the very end, because the final moments of this case are unlike anything you've ever seen, and the consequences will stay with you long after the video is over. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Judge Margaret Harrison was known across the nation as one of the toughest judges in America. For over 2 decades, she had presided over her courtroom with absolute authority, a reputation built on unwavering discipline and an unyielding commitment to the law. Defense attorneys feared her, prosecutors respected her, and colleagues quietly admired the sheer precision with which she delivered justice. She had earned the nickname the Steel Gavel, a title she wore with quiet pride. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, however, there was a shift in the air, something Margaret couldn't quite name. The golden autumn sunlight filtered through the towering windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany benches. Usually, the courtroom hummed with quiet tension as families awaited justice. Today, it felt heavier, almost charged, as if the walls themselves were bracing for the events to come. Margaret had arrived earlier than usual, her morning routine disrupted by a restless night. She sipped her coffee, now cold, staring down at the bustling city below, yet her thoughts were consumed by the case scheduled for that day. Something about it gnawed at her, stirring a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. An uneasy premonition that this session would test her in ways no previous case ever had. As she straightened her black robes and checked her reflection one last time, the composed professional staring back at her belied the flutter of doubt in her chest. Her assistant knocked lightly. "Judge Harrison, they're ready for you in the courtroom." She nodded and took a deep breath. The courtroom fell silent as she entered. The bailiff called for everyone to rise, and the ritual began. But when Margaret's eyes landed on the defendant's table, they froze for a moment. There sat David Williams, clad in the familiar orange jumpsuit, calm, composed, and strikingly dignified. Born into a world of hardship, David's life had been shaped by circumstances that many would call impossible. And yet, despite everything, he carried himself with a quiet strength that immediately captured her attention. The case was not new to her. Margaret had presided over several hearings, watched evidence pile up, observed the jury deliver its verdict. She knew the sentence would be carried out that evening. Yet something was different. There was no defiance in David's eyes. No bitterness. Just a strange, serene clarity that unsettled Margaret more than anger ever could. She noticed the courtroom officers shifting uneasily, the air thick with tension. The families of victims and witnesses were present, faces etched with grief and anticipation. Margaret's usual certainty, the ironclad confidence that had defined her career, felt fragile today. It was as though the weight of what was to come pressed down on her chest, reminding her that even the strongest resolve could be tested in the face of human vulnerability. As the clerk began reading the charges, Margaret's gaze remained on David. She saw a man quietly confronting the consequences of his actions, yet holding on to a sense of purpose, a glimmer of something more profound than fear or regret. And in that moment, she realized, this case would not be like any other. Today, in her courtroom of law and order, she would witness a story that challenged not just the letter of justice, but the very essence of what it meant to be human. The courtroom had settled into the rhythm of procedure. Papers shuffled, pens scratched, and the faint hum of the ventilation system filled the background. Judge Margaret Harrison had begun the formal sentencing process, her voice steady, authoritative, the embodiment of decades of judicial discipline. Yet, even as she spoke, her eyes kept returning to David Williams, the man who had somehow drawn her attention in a way no other defendant ever had. When the courtroom clerk finished reading the verdict and charges, David's public defender, a young attorney named Sarah Chen, rose with an unusual request. "Your Honor, she said, her voice betraying a hint of urgency. "My client wishes to address the court before sentencing." Margaret raised an eyebrow. She had presided over countless final statements. Typically, they were pleas for mercy, declarations of innocence, or emotional outbursts. Rarely had she witnessed sincerity presented with such calm. "Granted," she said, her voice clipped but attentive. David rose slowly. The metallic clink of his shackles echoed softly through the hushed courtroom. Every eye followed him. He stood tall, his posture unyielding despite the weight of the sentence that loomed over him like a shadow. And then he spoke. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, resonant. "I know that in a few hours, I will pay the ultimate price for my actions. I accept that. I am not here to beg for my life or claim innocence. What I did was wrong, and I have lived with that truth every single day since." A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Margaret felt herself leaning forward, drawn by the gravity in his words. This wasn't the usual plea, it was a measured acknowledgement of responsibility. He continued, his eyes fixed on hers. "But there is one thing I ask, not for myself, but for someone who deserves better than what I gave them. Someone who needs to know that even in my final hours, I thought about making things right." Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Margaret's pulse quickened. Every legal instinct screamed that such a request was unprecedented, even impossible. Yet there was a calmness in David that made her pause. Slowly, he reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small, worn photograph. Margaret recognized immediately what it was. A child's face, smiling innocently despite the weight of a world she could only imagine. "This is my daughter Amelia," he said, his voice breaking ever so slightly. "She is 7 years old now. I haven't seen her since she was 5. Her mother made the decision that I could not be part of her life, and I respect that. But before I leave this world, I want to record a message for her. A chance to show her that I loved her, that she mattered to me, even if I failed in every other way." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Margaret felt the gravity of the moment press down on her like never before. Families of victims sat frozen, their grief palpable. She caught the eyes of Mrs. Patterson, the mother of the young man David had killed. For the first time, Margaret noticed something unexpected, a quiet recognition, a soft nod that seemed to say, "Perhaps even this can be allowed." Margaret's mind raced. Legal precedent offered no guidance. No manual accounted for this request. The state's execution schedule was strict. The rules were clear. Yet here was a man, facing his final hours, asking not for clemency, but for a moment to speak to his child. And somehow she understood. This was not manipulation. This was love. Pure, unyielding, desperate love. In that moment, Margaret Harrison realized that justice and humanity were about to collide in a way she could not ignore. The words that would follow, the decision she would make, might define her career, and her understanding of what it truly meant to serve the law. Judge Margaret Harrison sat in her chambers later that morning, the photograph of David's daughter replaying in her mind. She could still see the small, smiling face, innocent and unaware of the storm surrounding her father. Margaret had built her career on clarity, precision, and adherence to the law. Yet now, for the first time in over 20 years, she faced a question she could not answer with a statute or precedent. David Williams wasn't asking for a delay, nor was he challenging the verdict. He was asking for a brief 30-minute opportunity to speak to his daughter before his execution. A final message of love, a fragment of humanity that the law had no framework to accommodate. It should have been impossible. It should have been denied. And yet, Margaret found herself considering it. She thought of the law as she had always known it. Impartial, strict, uncompromising. Any deviation could spark outrage from prosecutors, criticism from the legal community, and questions from the public. District Attorney Robert Chen had already made it clear that the execution schedule was final, and any change would be met with fierce objection. Yet, Margaret couldn't shake the image of the little girl, the quiet dignity in David's plea, and the unexpected understanding in the eyes of Mrs. Patterson, the victim's mother. Margaret remembered her own father, who had died when she was barely older than Amelia. She thought of all the questions she had never been able to ask, the moments she had never shared. If she had had a voice, a message to leave, would it have eased the pain? The thought made her chest ache, an unfamiliar vulnerability she hadn't felt in years. She glanced at the clock. Every minute brought David closer to his final hours. To deny him could be lawful, correct even. But was it just? And justice, she realized, was not only about punishment. It was about balance, about humanity, about recognizing the human connections that continued beyond the courtroom walls. Margaret called in Warden Thompson, a stern but experienced man in charge of the correctional facility. Warden, would it even be possible to allow a recording, under strict supervision, that wouldn't interfere with the scheduled execution? Thompson paused, weighing the request. It's highly unusual, Your Honor. But I've been in this job long enough to know that sometimes the most important actions aren't in any manual. If it's carefully controlled, it can be done. Margaret felt a small shift in the weight on her shoulders. There was a path, narrow and precarious, where law and compassion could meet. She returned to the courtroom, her robes heavy, her mind racing, yet her heart strangely lighter. This wasn't just about David. It was about his daughter, about Mrs. Patterson's silent nod of acknowledgement, and about the deeper meaning of justice itself. She knew the decision would be controversial. Legal scholars would debate it, prosecutors would challenge it, and her career would be scrutinized. But Margaret understood that sometimes the law needed a human voice to guide it. In that quiet moment of reflection, she realized that true justice wasn't blind. It was measured, thoughtful, and occasionally, courageous enough to make room for mercy. When the court reconvened, Margaret's eyes met David's across the room. She saw calm, acceptance, and hope, all in one gaze. She knew that the decision she was about to make would define not only his final hours, but her own legacy. And for the first time, the steel resolve that had guided her career felt less like armor and more like a bridge, one she was willing to cross. By late afternoon, the tension in the courthouse had shifted. David Williams was escorted from the courtroom to the state correctional facility under strict supervision. His orange jumpsuit gleamed under the overhead lights, a stark reminder of the hours that remained in his life. Yet something had changed in him since that morning. The quiet calm had deepened into a resolute peace, the kind that only comes when a person accepts the consequences of their actions and finds purpose in their final moments. Judge Margaret Harrison watched the preparations unfold from her chambers. She had spoken to Warden Thompson, who had arranged a private room equipped with professional recording devices. 2 officers would remain present for security, ensuring the process was controlled and precise. Everything was planned down to the minute. 30 minutes, no more, no less, was all David would have. The extraordinary part of the arrangement was Mrs. Patterson, the mother of the young man David had killed. She had requested to be present during the recording, to hear firsthand the words her son's killer wished to leave for his own child. It was unprecedented, yet Margaret understood the significance. This wasn't simply about legal procedure, it was about humanity, connection, and perhaps even a small measure of healing. As David entered the recording room, he held Amelia's photograph tightly in his hand. The tiny picture had been touched countless times, edges soft from years of careful handling. He knelt slightly, arranging the camera, and took a deep breath. When Mrs. Patterson entered, he did not flinch or avert his eyes. Instead, he nodded respectfully, a gesture of acknowledgement and humility. For 30 minutes, David spoke from the depths of his heart. He recounted memories he would never share with his daughter in life, words of love and hope, and explanations of the man he had been beyond his worst choices. His voice trembled only once, and even then it was a tremor of raw honesty rather than fear. Every word was deliberate, every sentence a gift to Amelia, a small fragment of her father to carry with her through life. Outside the room, Margaret felt a mixture of awe and trepidation. The legal parameters of her decision had been followed precisely, yet what was unfolding inside was far more profound than any courtroom could contain. Justice had not been abandoned. The execution would proceed as scheduled. But for those 30 minutes, humanity had taken precedence over procedure, and the result was undeniable. A father reaching across the impossible divide of his own failings to connect with his child. When the recording ended, David looked at Mrs. Patterson and spoke softly. "Thank you for allowing this. I hope it helps, in some small way." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, acknowledging that while forgiveness might not be possible, understanding and humanity could exist even in the darkest circumstances. As David was escorted back to his cell to await the evening, Margaret reflected on what she had witnessed. In 30 minutes, a bridge had been built, between father and daughter, between victim and offender, between justice and compassion. It was a moment she knew would stay with her forever, a testament to the power of empathy even in a world governed by rules and consequences. As evening fell over the city, the courthouse and correctional facility alike seemed to hold their breath. The moment David Williams had prepared for, his final hours, the ultimate consequences of his choices, was approaching. Yet, something profound had already been set in motion. The 30-minute recording, a simple act of a father reaching across the impossibility of his circumstances, had shifted the narrative of justice, humanity, and mercy in ways Judge Margaret Harrison could never have anticipated. Margaret sat in her chambers, reflecting on the day's events. For over 23 years, her reputation had been built on impartiality and steel resolve. She had presided over cases where emotion was carefully locked away, where the law was a rigid framework meant to maintain order and fairness. Yet today, she had glimpsed a truth that no manual or legal precedent could teach. The law could coexist with compassion. Justice could be firm without being devoid of humanity. She thought of David's daughter Amelia, who would one day watch the recording and hear her father's voice. She imagined the effect it might have, a small light of understanding, a connection to a man she could never meet in life. It was not forgiveness, it was not absolution, it was something equally vital, recognition of love, accountability, and the enduring presence of a parent's care, even from afar. In the courtroom, the echoes of that morning lingered. Mrs. Patterson, the mother of the young man whose life had been taken, had witnessed a rare moment of grace. She had seen remorse, humility, and a gesture that did not erase pain but acknowledged it. Even in tragedy, she had allowed a bridge to form, a space where humanity could exist alongside grief and justice. Margaret knew that her decision would be scrutinized for years to come. Lawyers would debate the legality, scholars would analyze the precedent, and public opinion would be divided. But she also knew that the value of her choice could not be measured in rules alone. It was measured in the lives touched, the hearts affected, and the hope that even in the darkest moments, a small act of compassion could shine through. When David was escorted for the final time to the execution chamber, his composure remained intact. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had accepted the consequences of his past yet had left behind a fragment of himself for his daughter. Margaret watched from afar, tears unbidden at the corners of her eyes, knowing that the steel judge who had ruled with iron for decades had witnessed something far stronger than any legal victory. She had witnessed humanity. The gavel, which had fallen so many times to determine guilt and punishment, now symbolized more than authority. It marked the moment when justice met compassion, when a judge recognized the enduring power of love, responsibility, and human connection. That day, Judge Margaret Harrison's legacy expanded beyond her courtroom. It became a story of balance, courage, and the understanding that even in the strictest systems, empathy could guide decisions that resonate far beyond a single verdict. Years later, when Amelia finally watched her father's recording, she heard more than apologies. She heard care, recognition, and love. And somewhere in that fragile yet enduring connection, the story of a judge, a father, and a victim's mother became a testament to the profound difference that courage and compassion can make, even in the face of the gravest consequences.